Welcome, everyone, to our examination of the 9 elements of a person-centered system. This is session 3. We're looking at advocacy.
So we're here today as a part of the NCAPPS initiative to promote person-centered systems and practices. This is a great way for us to get understanding and buy-in and commitment to person-centered thinking, planning, and practices at all levels. We want to examine the role of advocacy in our system today and also have a commitment to person-centered thinking, planning, and practices. We'll also give you some opportunities to think about changes that may need to happen and how to implement those changes based on what you're learning. The last time we were together, we asked you to revisit your vision and your mission, and also think a little bit about your values so that you could evaluate your day-to-day behavior by looking at it through a lens of values. So we gave you some exercises. We asked you to read the 9 pillars of a person-centered system and to complete a self-reflection after each pillar. We also asked you to complete a series of activity sheets. One was related to vision and mission. And then you took a look at your values so that you could describe on a day-to-day basis what those look like in action for you. I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who's going to talk to you about the content for today.
Thank you, Tanya. And today, as Michael said, we are going to be looking at advocacy and the importance of advocates, both internal and external advocates. So let us introduce you to our next set of elephants as part of our elemental series here. We've got a large elephant in the background, which really is representative of the system. It is the big thing in the room. And the little elephant in front is to represent the advocates, those who are internal to an organization, who may not have what they feel is the power to make changes, as well as the external advocates outside of the system that can really help move things forward. And you'll see that the little elephant is guiding the larger elephant, because the advocates really are a way for us to look at things from a fresh perspective. And how do we really look at that in a way where we are focusing on partnership? When we are looking at advocacy groups, we need to recognize that advocates are not adversaries. And for many, many years in our system, I think we have created this feeling that it has to be an adversarial role. And we really need to change that, because advocates really are our partners. And what advocates do is they really apply pressure to how we do our work. The pressure can be positive or negative. When it's positive, we have that partnership, and that's really what we want to see happen. When it is negative, when they may be pointing out things that we don't really want to see, don't really want to hear, it may lead to some of that adversarial relationships and maybe negative. What we really need to recognize is what is the role of the advocate and how can we appreciate what they are telling us, whether it's the good or the not so good. So we'll look at how we can make that happen. It really helps us look beyond what we need to do in our system and get past the status quo and what we've always been doing. When we are looking at working with advocates in a framework of partnership, we really need to think about what's going to help that be effective. We need to have effective communication and effective collaboration. We need to be able to present the information in ways that people are willing to hear. And above all else, we need to think about how are we maintaining those professional relationships. If we really want to think about being cliche about it, we need to make sure that the right people are saying the right thing to the right audience. So how do we really frame that and support each other to be able to listen to understand rather than listening to respond? So we need to step back and look at what is being said and how are we hearing that, and approach it from a leaning in perspective as opposed to being reactionary. I think this is going to be Michael, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the types of advocates that we will see.
So as we think of external advocates, people outside of the system, it's helpful to think of them as focusing on one of 3 areas, either on working for individuals, working on an issue, or working on the system. And if we look at each one, you can see their power and how we can support them. Individual advocates are people who are working with a person or a small group of people. Quite often they're family members. Quite often they're peer advocates. Quite often they're self-advocates. And their best efforts are focused on helping a person. And they are fierce advocates for those individuals and helping them move to a desired life in the community. if we're working with them, we can listen and discover what is working and not working in the pieces of the system that they're in touch with as they help people move to desired lives in the community. We can learn about effectiveness and efficiency within the system and have regular listening sessions that will inform us in very powerful ways about what needs to be maintained and what needs to be changed within the system. Issue advocates are people that you frequently see testifying before the legislature. They're looking at a particular focused issue, which might be pay for people doing direct support, might be expanding eligibility, it might be advocating for self-determination or another new program. And they again are powerful and they're focused. And they're often responsible for the changes, some of the positive changes we see in the system. But if they're not looking at how what they're advocating for works within the system, they can be advocating in ways that while they're largely helpful, some of the unintended consequences can cause difficulties. On the other hand, the system advocates are working on transformation, and they're the people who really need to know the 9 elements. They're the people who need to know how alignment works. They're the people who need to know the difference between positive pressure for change and just focused compliance pressure. But we need to keep in mind that these individual issue advocates can also become system advocates. They wish to learn, they wish to become more effective. We can support them as they march down this path on this journey and become system advocates. And as Bob said, external advocates can be allies. We all have different agendas and our agendas are not identical. So there can be things that external advocates that are looking for that the people who are managing the system say we can't afford or it's not feasible for us. But if we look at where our agendas overlap, where we have congruence between desires, then we have people who can be allies more than being adversaries. But to do that, we need clarity of roles. We need acknowledged expectations. So there's no need to be upset when somebody's advocating for something that is not going to be supported by the system, as long as we have an understanding of who's doing what and what the roles are. But to do this, you have to build trust. And trust is really about keeping promises. It's about believing that what one person says, what their word is, can be counted on. Trust also requires boundaries. You have to know where the person advocacy will lead, where it crosses the line that you make clear, and where it can be supported. Where there's trust, where there's clarity, then there's also the potential for allies. So part of what we need to do is support the external advocates. Next slide. So all of the advocates, whether they're individual, issue, or system, need to be clear about the difference between power over and power with. Even benign paternalism can be oppression. They need to have the same opportunities to learn skills as others within the system. So they need to have opportunities to participate in person-centered thinking training and person-centered planning training, as well as opportunities to explore the effectiveness of the 9 elements. And they need to be able to use those skills. So those skills need to be supported. And as they work, they will come up with stories of successful change impact, successful change efforts. And those successful change efforts, those stories need to be stories that the system collects and shares, because that's how they're going to see the impact of their advocacy. And that positive impact needs to be acknowledged as we do this. And this is something that you can see in some states is already happening, where in others, advocates are seen as enemies and not allies. They're not only external advocates, they're internal advocates. Bob's going to share some ideas about that.
So when we think of internal advocates, there really are 2 types that we see within our organizations, within the system structure. There are those who really are the champions of person-centeredness and really want to move things forward in line with the vision that we have in our organizations or in our system. And then there are advocates who really are focused on system transformation and really thinking about what we can do to move the entire system forward. When we think about the first type of advocate, the person-centered vision advocate, this really is the person who is that internal champion. They're the quote unquote, the natural. They've got the gift, the passion, the opportunity to really move things forward. They're familiar with person-centered approaches and really try to make that happen. What we've often seen with these champions over the years is they do things differently. And because they do things differently, they've often been shut down. So we really need to think about, in this world we are transforming in our system, is what can we do to say it is okay to think outside the box. It is okay to help us learn how to do something differently. So these internal champions need to be supported, because now everything is okay, when previously they may have been dismissed and discounted for doing things differently. So what can we do to really help nurture them and encourage them to continue moving forward? When we're thinking about system transformation advocates, we really want to think about what do we need to do so that our system can be more effective and more efficient within the practices and boundaries that our system has and needs to have. So some of this comes from the appreciation and application of person-centered thinking skills. Some of it comes from knowing other quality improvement management skills, such as process mapping or lean processes to really move things forward. We really want to think results-based accountability could be another way that we look at improving how our system works. We really need to think about how this all fits together and what we can do to support both these person-centered champions and this system transformation. Go to our next slide, please. So when we are thinking about the internal advocates, we want to make sure that they are skilled and knowledgeable in what we really need to move our system forward, and being mindful about what can we do to help avoid those negative unintended consequences. If we have recognized that these people are champions, one of the things we also want to think about is these are individuals that others listen to. Maybe it's not in their title, but they still are that informal leader, or maybe it is in their title and they are an official leader of the organization. How do we make sure that they are being listened to by others and supported by those above them to really make things happen? We know that this is an evolution, which means we need to be persistent. So internal advocates have to have that ability to keep the effort alive. What are those short-term wins that they can set in motion? What are those things that are going to take more time? And how do we as leaders support them to make that happen? We also need to think about how we evaluate those external requests when there are consequences by doing things differently. For a long time, prior to looking at things through a person-centered lens, we may have accepted things that our system does as being okay. And then after going through person-centered practices and thinking and training, we realize that's not as okay as I thought it was. Once you see it, you can never unsee it. So what can we do to help recognize those things, not penalize ourselves for that, because we did what we did because it was best practice at the time. Fortunately, the thing with best practice, it changes as we learn new ways of doing things. So how can we support everybody to move forward for the newest way of doing things in a way that makes sense, that's effective and is efficient? So we really want to make sure that they maintain their passion, they maintain their willingness to try new things. When there are things that are going to take longer, what can we do to have good compromise to really keep things moving? And how are we making sure that we are keeping people informed of the gradual changes that are happening so that people are included in moving things forward? We could move on to the next slide. So in order to make this happen, we really want to think about who are our internal advocates, who are our champions. As I said, these are people who have the gift and the commitment, so they're able to really do this and be okay with doing it and being supported in doing it. We need to think about where are there opportunities that they can support others to use the skills and try to do things in a different way. That's going to encourage them to spread the skills by either role modeling or demonstrating a new way of doing things. One of the things we often find is if we show people in a natural way, rather than saying, today we are going to do the working, not working tool. People don't really like that because they may not know what that is. But rather, if we are supporting those champions to do this naturally, hey, let's figure out what this situation is all about. What's really working in supporting this person? What's not working in supporting this person? and then help others learn how to do that in a more natural way, it's going to really move things forward. And this all happens by looking at what are those things that these champions can do without having to ask permission. If you remember, those things we refer to as level 1 changes. And are there ways for those folks to document that stuff so that it can be passed on and others can do it? So we really want to think about, how do we share this information? And one way that we look at doing that is through the use of stories. And Michael's going to talk a little bit about stories as we look at thinking about how we can make these levels of change happen for folks.
As we look at this, we need to think of this as advocacy as pressure. And again, looking at, you have positive pressure for change and you have compliance pressure. Positive pressure causes enthusiasm. Compliance pressure causes groans and efforts at just getting through the day, grinding it all out. And if you think about all the opportunities, you can see that some of them are levers to create positive change, and can we make use of them? Well, one of the things that our colleague Mary Lou Bourne wanted to share with you is how the self-assessment process can be helpful in doing this. She was unable to be with it, and I have the enviable task of sharing it, but the unenviable effort to share it with her same skill. Next slide. So if you look at what we were talking about earlier, we said trust is a key element. Well, how do you know if it's present? Ask some questions about how you're building collaboration and partnership, how you're building trust with advocacy and self-advocacy organizations, and ask them. One of the things that this process does is it supports you in reaching out to people and asking, where are we in this process? Where are we doing it? And if there's no trust, if trust has been broken, you have to really look at how you can rebuild it. Next slide. So it's not only about viewing advocates as partners, but it's having people engage. It's having two-way communication. It's people who feel listened to and people who are doing the listening. If you think about that, how many people feel listened to? And quite often you'll discover fewer people feel listened to than you think. And it's not because we're not listening, it's because we're not listening in a way that acknowledges that we not only heard, but we're willing to act on what we heard. All you do is listen and you don't act. And there's got to be some real questions. And these questions will help you sort this out. Next slide. So there's a series of questions posed here. I'm going to ask you to reflect on them. How do people, our leaders currently build trust with advocates, even when facing opposite views? How is it working now? How could it be better? How can you, in your role, begin to build methods where you routinely seek input from advocates in creating public policy, not only on person-centered practices, but on things like funding, where you're looking at alignment. We're talking about land session, because if people are pushing in different ways, in different directions, you don't get the movement that you're seeking. So we're going to ask you, next slide, pause and reflect. And you can either pause now or you can pause. So in our years of working with people, that we need to lead change with stories and we need to manage change with data. And what we found is that humans are hardwired to respond to stories. But when a story catches somebody's heart, when a story catches somebody's head, that they will respond by getting on board. So if you're trying to recruit people, to convince people that they should start and be on board with this, you need stories. But you don't just need stories, you need stories that respond to the people to whom you wish to impress or you wish to recruit. And if you just have a story that appeals to hearts, and you don't have stories that appeal to minds, you don't have stories that let people know that it's fiscally sound, you aren't going to get everybody on board. You're going to get only part of the people on board. So what the business people who talk about managing change say is you need stories that appeal to the head, heart, and wallet. And if you're good, you can have stories that appeal to two or all three, but you need to be conscious of your audience. What are they going to respond to? And stories are also a way to maintain momentum. John Cotter, in his many books about change, is consistent in saying you need to plan for short-term wins. And a short-term win means that you have an accomplishment that people will notice. And that accomplishment is always presented in the story. It may be accompanied by quantitative data, And you need to have quantitative data, and you need to be able to say, we have good stories, but we have good movement. Because the downside of relying purely on stories is that you can have a story, you can have good stories, but they can still represent exceptions rather than the rule. They can represent those times we've had good efforts, but not the broad efforts. You need stories that demonstrate that you've had movement, but you need stories that also indicate that this is happening for a large number of people. You need qualitative and quantitative data working together. And you need to ask yourself, if you look at your quantitative data, are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring what matters to the person? When you look at outcomes for people, are the outcomes reflective of what's important to the person, what's important for, or a good balance between? Are we measuring those things that indicate we're actually moving toward our vision? So our vision says people have lives of their own choosing in their community, and we believe that employment is a piece of that. How many people are employed, and how do we define employment? And do the outcomes that people have actually really reflect the lives that they seek, the lives that they desire? When you start looking at change, it's helpful to think of change as happening at 3 levels. Next slide. Level 1, level 2, and level 3. And to think about this, level 1 are the changes you can make without permission. Level 2 are the changes that you make with permission, with thoughtful changes in structure, practice, or policy. Level 3 are the changes that cross organizations that are made at the system level. So if we think of it as a level 1 change, is something that you see something that makes a difference in the lives of a person. And you don't need permission, you just need to notice it and act on it. And that becomes a story of how you've helped someone. It becomes one that you can absolutely share. Level 2 changes are changes where you discover, you take the lessons from those individual stories and start saying, we could have better outcomes. We could feel positive for people if we changed our practice, we changed our structures. And that might be employment. We're seeing a great deal more emphasis on employment across the country. And we're seeing that the only requirement to be employed is a volitional muscle movement. Level 3 changes are the changes that are broader and sweeping in policy. So in Minnesota, they just had a change in rules to enforce and make more powerful the changes that were in the HCBS final rule. The final rule itself is an excellent example of level 3 changes. Level 3 are those system level changes that other people then need to follow. And we will talk later in another session about how they create pressure for change and the difference between compliance pressure and the soul pressure and positive pressure being the change. Pressure for change that makes a real difference in the lives of the people that we support. But Tanya is going to be talking to you about internal advocates.
Just as a reminder for participants, when you see this elephant that tells you to pause, reflect, and act, it's a signal to you that you can stop your video and think about whatever it is we've just shared with you. Sometimes it's an opportunity to stop and do a worksheet. In this case, it's something we want you to think about that will tie to a worksheet that Bob is going to share with you a little bit later in the presentation. We're going to talk about 3 types of internal advocates. I think it's really important that we understand that there are advocates that may be people who use services and supports of the organization. So we would call them peer advocates. Peer advocates can really create positive pressure for change. And it's especially important when it is developed to complement other forms of advocacy that's going on in a significant way. There's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that the methods applied by professional advocates, human rights advocates, people who are working on behalf of people with disabilities, often in the pursuit of goals that would benefit the person who's using services and supports, can actually be damaging and counterproductive, because rather than eliminate the relations of power or the interplay between power and domination over those who they aim to benefit, they sometimes actually sustain it. So peer advocacy can really correct this situation because it fights imbalance, and at the same time, it empowers both the peer advocate and those supported by the organization in a much more immediate way. It gives the person who's using services and supports a chance to share their voice, a chance to build their own skills, a chance to really reflect on those things that matter most to them, and to put those forth in such a way that others can connect to that message. Family members also are often great advocates for change, but family members need those opportunities to learn advocacy skills. Bob talked about how it can be adversarial. If we approach it in a way that is unhelpful, we might take an adversarial stance, whereas really when we think about joining with others and collaborating for a common cause, that will help us see that the difference of power over, power with is something that we can actually use to our advantage as we work with people to help people understand that power with is the stance that we want to take. And through our advocacy actions, we are able to convey that message. And then finally, of course, the people who do the work may also be advocates for the people supported by the organization. At the systems level, as Michael was talking to you about systems level advocates, those are people who often have a real opportunity for change, either at the organizational level, so level 2, changes in policy, changes in practice or procedure within an organization, or at level 3, so outside of the organization, those changes that might be impactful to many organizations who do similar things. And if we're going to think about systems level and the internal advocates in their role, we want to make sure that we're including people who are interacting with those organizations, those who write the policy, procedure, and practice, those who govern it, and those who are making rules and legislations that might be outside of the organization as well. And each one of those factors really needs to receive the support needed to be successful in their advocacy. To do that, we have to build trust. We have to give people the information and the education that they need. And trust is really based on making promises that can be delivered on meaningfully. So we might begin by truly looking at the rules, truly looking at our practices on a daily basis, looking at how effective we are, looking at how efficient we are in an effort to help bring about good changes. So here's a place for you to really think. Use the opportunity maybe to pause your video, think about, the roles and the positions you should seek to be champions, advocates for you. How do we select them, and what do we do to make this happen? How do we find people who have the gifts and the passions? What do we do in engaging those peer advocates and making sure that they have the training that they need to be effective? Who's on fire for these issues, and really wanting to make sure that they're connecting with others about the importance of the issues at hand? So all of that would be something we're going to ask you to think about a little bit later. Bob will share a worksheet with you that we've developed to give you an opportunity to reflect on it in your specific situation and think about who might be those internal advocates that could be helpful to the things that are important to you. So I'll turn this over to Bob.
Thank you, Tanya. And as we started this presentation, we said we really need to think about what can we do to help those external advocates become systems advocates, to really think about how we can move things forward. And one of the best ways to do that is really look at the people who are using the services and supports, the people with lived experience. These are the people who know how the system is really working for them. And what can we do to support them to be able to share the things that are working well, the things that aren't working so well, and could have some opportunities for improvement. And what can we do to help them share that message that fosters partnership rather than resentment? So we really want to think about where are those opportunities where they can talk with others? Are they sitting at the table? Doing some work with a mental health provider, and they're saying, you want me to sit at you want me to drive the car, but I'm not even in the car. So what can we do to really help make sure that people are present to really be part of the solution? And what sort of training can we provide to them? Are we offering opportunities for peer-to-peer support? So those peers who have figured it out can help others learn how to do that. And we get some peer-to-peer mentoring going on. Are we helping people keep track of what's working well, using some of the person-centered thinking skills by looking at working, not working, or a learning log, or a 4+1 questions to think about what has been tried in their lives. What did they learn from that? What are they pleased about? What are they concerned about? And what could be done differently for the next time around? These are ways that we can start to gather that information in a constructive way so that we can then use it to move forward. And we are hearing directly from the people who are being impacted by all of the things that we put in place. That is going to help us really improve our effectiveness and our efficiency. We could go to the next slide, please. As we do that, we need to encourage people to be able to share their stories and share their stories in a way that get others to want to share their stories. And what are we doing to help people find their voice and that their voice is actually heard and listened to, because then we can act on it. Are we helping people support others to develop plans for their lives? Are we looking at peer mentors or peer support specialists at the planning meetings that can help maybe ahead of the meeting to think about what is it that you want to share at the meeting? What are the things that you really want to have as outcomes in your life? And how can that be phrased in a way that people are willing to listen to and support those efforts? It really takes us from that power over view of we know what's best for you and we're going to focus on things that you may not want, but we think you need, to what can we help you do the things you need to do and get what you want. So let's flip it and have that power with. And that's going to help people have positive control of their lives. That's going to help our system look at what do we need to be doing perhaps a little bit differently so that we can make that happen. One example of this is People Planning Together, which is a training for people with lived experience to train others with lived experience about how to develop their own plans. And then what can we do to help those who are facilitating the plans and developing the plans for the system, listen to that, use that as part of the documentation that goes into the system and gets approved. That's going to help our system move forward. It's also going to make the job of a case manager a little bit easier because they're getting information that is more valuable and more likely to be successful for that person. So we really need to think about what are we doing in this whole arena of peer specialists. Next slide. And we've kind of mentioned that person-centered thinking skills are very helpful in making this happen. What we know is that when people go to a training to learn about person-centeredness, they are exposed to these concepts. It starts to change the framework of how we look at things. And as I said earlier, once you see something, you cannot unsee it. So we really need to look at things a little bit differently. How are we doing this at all levels of the system, from senior leadership to direct care, to people who are using services and supports? Let's get that exposure. Exposure doesn't do any good if we don't create opportunities for people to practice what they've learned. And how do we start to make this the way we do our work? That starts to develop competence. Competence will not be successful if we don't have opportunities to provide feedback. Those internal advocates, those champions who have been doing this and know how to do it, they can provide some feedback so that people are not developing competence of the wrong things. They are getting feedback on how to do it correctly, so they're getting competence in doing it right. It doesn't do us any good to have people who are very competent in doing it wrong. So feedback is really important. And that happens with the role modeling process. If that role modeling process continues, as we talked about, we need to be persistent in this. That's when it becomes habit, that pretty soon we are doing it without even thinking about it. Many of you at this point in time may be doing working and not working without even thinking about it. You may start to recognize what is important to people, those things that make them happy, content, satisfied, fulfilled, just by hearing how they are talking about things. And we're putting that into the context of what is important for people so that they can stay healthy and safe while they're being happy. That's going to help lead to habit. And when it becomes habit, it's no longer we are a person-centered system. It's We are a system, and this is how we do our work. That's what we want to strive for. And advocates can be very helpful in making that happen. Now, Michael talked a little bit about stories, and I want to go into a little bit more depth with stories. If we look at the next slide, stories really are a way to think about how we spread the word. As Michael said, it's a core way that we learn. It helps us connect the dots. You know, if you think about parables or Aesop's fables, we already know what the outcome of the story is going to be and what the moral of the story is because we've connected the dots. We need to be thinking about how we do that with evolving our system. How do we connect the dots? So what are we doing to really think about that head, heart, or wallet aspect of things? Are we doing intellectual stories or emotional stories or financial stories? And this can be a change for us because in our industry, what we tend to do is we focus on the heart stories because it makes us feel good. But if we are sharing a heart story with our finance people, they probably don't really care about that emotional tug. They want to know what's the bottom line and how is this being beneficial to the organization. If we're talking about it with legislators, how are we making sure that we are showing the effectiveness of what we're doing? And we have the data so we can really hit the intellectual piece of things. So we really need to think about how we frame our stories for our intended audience. And we will give you an opportunity. One of the things we will upload to our team site is a structure for stories, because many of you are probably thinking, I'm not good with stories. I'm not a storyteller. In reality, we are all good storytellers because stories really are about things that we know. And when we know something, we can really talk about it. The difference when we put it into a story format, though, is we provide a structure that causes us to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It provides some framework. And so we will give you a framework. If you would like to try to write a story, and you can send it to us and we can give you some feedback about that may be helpful because stories lead to change. Stories are what we want advocates to be sharing with us. Stories are what we want advocates to be sharing with the legislature. We want to be able to make sure that they're powerful stories that are hitting the right audience with the right words. So is it an intellectual story that's geared around data? Is it an emotional story that's about those feel-good things? Or is it a financial story that talks about the bottom line? All of this can be helpful and make advocacy that much stronger to create a partnership. So I'm going to pass it over to Michael to start to wrap things up here.
So one of the things we found, which is always a bit disturbing, is that while we all love to be change agents, we also need to be willing to be change targets. Change agents are our favorite role, where we look at what needs to change and tell other people about how practices need to change, how policies need to change, and how other people need to change. But as Bob was talking about, and Tanya was talking about, this is a change in how we think. This is a change in how we behave. For this to be successful, we have to do things that only demonstrate difference, but also still build trust. We need to have those advocates looking at how they can leverage change within the system without making enemies. Because you can be a radical change agent unless you're also a change target. You'll alienate more than you will advocate. So think about where your change agentry, where your advocacy is effective and where it is not, and see if there are ways in which you could change, be more effective as a change agent through being a change target.
So as Tanya mentioned, this is the form that we would like you to complete as you think about advocates and how we look at expanding advocates and what can we do to really make that work well. So you'll see that our top table is for external advocates, where we really want you to think about who is that person that could be a good external advocate for us, and what agency do they work for, what affiliation do they have, if it's for a collective group or something. That can help us figure out, are we getting the right people at the table? And then what is the role that they're going to be playing in these meetings where we're going to be partnering? Is it a role where it's just about listening and sharing information? Is it a role where they will be part of the decision-making process? Oftentimes, we have advocates sitting at the table where they think they've got the ability to make decisions and influence things, when really their role was just to provide information, but we didn't tell them that. How can we be clear in the structure in the role that we want those people to be sharing that information and being part of the process? Is it some other role that you would want them to do? That needs to be clarified right at the beginning of things so people know what their focus is. And then I also want you to think about, what opportunity do they have to create change? Based upon their role in their function, can they make changes on their own, that level 1 change? Do they work within an organizational structure where they can actually start to role model that for the organization and make some changes in the organization? So that's a level 2 change, and they have the ability to make those decisions. Or is it a level 3 change where they are working at the systems level and can be influencing policy and rules and regulations, and perhaps looking at the federal level to really make some changes happen? Let's identify where those opportunities lie for those folks. And then from an internal standpoint, really thinking about who are the people who are those naturals? What department do they work in? What is their role? Are they someone who has the ability to make decisions that others are going to follow? They are in a supervisory or leader role. Or are they someone who may not have that official power, but they could still make some of those level 1 changes and identify what level 2 changes need to be made in the organization? That can be very helpful collectively for the organization to become stronger. So we really want to see where you can come up with some people that you can develop these partnerships with. And for those internal advocates, what supports do they need to really be part of this and be engaged and be willing to share information? A lot of times people may have the information, but they may not have that psychological safety to share that information. So what needs to happen to really support them in order to be open and not be judged for what they are saying, and really recognize that they're trying to do it for the benefit of the organization? That's part of where you may need to become that change target and change how you've responded to similar situations in the past. You can always be that change agent and advocate for change. Not a bad place to be, but it's much more powerful when you make the changes yourself and start to role model it, because we know role modeling is the way to really change behavior, and you have the power to do that. So that will be your assignment for when we meet for our next World Café. And we want to make sure that we continue thinking about where you have the ability to make some of these changes as well. So thinking about everything we've done with advocacy today, where do you have that control? Where do you have that influence? What are the concerns about how advocacy is currently working within your systemic structure or organizational structure? And think about where you can take some control and make changes happen.
So if I summarize all of what I heard here today and think about the different kinds of advocacy roles I play myself in my life, I do play an advocacy role at issue levels in some instances, and certainly at systems levels and others. So I think about using my resources, including my voice. Sometimes my physical presence is necessary. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's energy. Most of the time it's time, and certainly there's opportunities to support or to partner with people, or to partner with institutions or policies that align with my values. All of that because I envision a world of equity and justice, and no matter what the issue is, the concepts remain the same. And when we truly open ourselves up for advocates, we have to be willing to listen. And I think this is a great way for you to think through who are the advocates that are connected to the work that you do or to your world and your life. When we don't think about it, when we don't bring people in to help us advocate for whatever the cause is, sometimes we have consequences that are unintended. And if we don't have the right people making decisions with us, that's a likelihood. So change can be scary, but also it doesn't happen unless we look for opportunities to change and figure out who our partners are in that change. So for you to prepare for your next session, we are asking you to think about those external advocates that need to be engaged and what are the expectations for everyone. Think about also who are the internal advocates. So identify those champions inside your organization. What needs to be done to encourage their involvement and their participation? Do some good reflection and do some research and searching around for who's in your midst that might be a good advocate in different areas. We are scheduled to get back together next Monday on April 25th, 2022, from 2 to 3 o'clock Eastern for our World Café and reflection on this information. If you need to be in touch with us, you can reach us at the email addresses here. You know that you can also get in touch with us on our Teams channel that you've been invited to. We've seen some of you interacting and engaging there, and hope that you'll continue to do that. It's really fun to connect with you there about these topics. But if you need to get in touch with us some other way, you can do that here. And we'd like to thank you for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you the next time we are all together next Monday.